Welcome to this week's session of Fridays on the Farm. Today we're going to start talking about your working facilities and some of the equipment and designs to be thinking about as you plan those working facilities or think about improvements to your own. So as you start thinking about your working facilities, there's four main components that we're going to talk about. The first thing is your catch pen and your crowding pens. Then we'll talk about the alley that funnels those cattle into our third thing, which is the squeeze chute and the head gate. And then we'll also talk about loadout options that are here as well. The other thing you've got to consider when you're planning your working facilities or thinking about making improvements is, what are your goals? Do you have an operation where you're mainly going to be working calves, maybe processing preconditioned calves, so you need to have that squeeze chute with a head gate to make that a little bit easier to do things like castrations and maybe even dehorning? Do you have a set of cattle that may be a little bit more spirited than others that you need to have some reinforcements there for those cattle that get a little bit high-headed compared to some of our more gentle breeds? Do you have really gentle cattle that you need to be able to keep them encouraged to move forward and do some of those things? By knowing what your goals are, knowing your breed, knowing your herd, the other thing to think about is, how often are you going to be using these facilities? Do you have a herd that you're only going to be working cows once or twice a year? Or are you running a backgrounding operation that you may be getting calves in 3 or 4 times a year? So think about those things as you're designing this and find a system that works for you and works for your herd. When we talk about a system, we want a system that flows and works for your operation. So it's important to know what those goals are for you on the front end, and that might save you a whole lot of headache when you get ready to start actually working your cattle. So as we start to look at your pen setup, it's really important that you have a facility that your cattle can flow through that makes sense for your operation. Here's 3 different sets of pens, and you can kind of see the way those gates are arranged. It's important that our gates can swing either direction to either move cattle one way or move cattle the other, depending on what you're trying to do. We want to create holes for those cattle to move through and try to make it as easy on all of us as we can. And so you can go through and look at each one of those. They all funnel a little bit differently. So depending on what your goals are, what kind of equipment you have, there's lots of different options out there that could work. So when we get into the crowding pens, this is the pen that's directly behind your working chute and alleyway. And this is where we're pushing calves in. We're getting them closer before they go all the way into the chute. So it's important that we've got a way that those cows can move smoothly forward where we want them to go. When you look at the straight line over here on the left, there's a corner, makes it a little bit more difficult where some of those cows can move in, but there's gates that can sweep behind and push those cattle the direction we want them to go. The function on the right is more of kind of the curved structure that we see that we recommend the most, because it keeps those cattle moving in the correct direction we want them to go. The left can work. It's just making sure that those gates are functioning like they should to keep those cattle moving in the right direction. We want to keep things as smooth, as easy as we can. Lots of times cattle want to work for us. They want to go the right directions. We just have to make sure they've got a way to do it. And the way we want them to go is the easiest direction that they can go. If your cattle aren't cooperating, if they're getting to a point and they get bottlenecked up or they keep trying to turn around, sometimes we can go back to our pen setup and correct some of those on the front end to make it easier on all of us. When it gets to your working alley, you can do straight alleys or curved alleys. The biggest thing is you don't want room for those cows or calves to turn around. This is an example of a farm here in Hot Spring County that he works some little calves and a lot of big calves and bulls. So he created his own system of making that alleyway narrower for those calves. This is something he built. It's a solid wooden wall. These pieces come out when he needs to move bigger cattle through here. But this makes that alleyway smaller so those calves can't get turned around. They're also solid. Cows are very visual. We want them to go where the hole is. So if you can add solid walls to your working facility, it can really help point your cows in the right direction. The other thing is, think about your cut gates. Some people use poles in a system like this. You can see where his cross ties are, where he can slide those poles in behind calves to keep them from turning around. If you go up farther in the dark, he does have a cut gate where he can move them to scales if he needs to. But those cut gates keep your cattle from going backwards. They keep them moving forwards and can also help you when you're sorting as you need them. Another factor to think about in your alleyway is, what if something goes wrong? Cattle don't always cooperate like we hope they're going to, so having some type of emergency release panel. This could be for your cow that rears up. Maybe she gets hung up, maybe she falls, whatever that reason is, sometimes we need to get cattle out of there quicker, and there may be something in front of them, we can't run them, that we can't let out, etc. So having that emergency option on a side gate really does help out in your alleyways as well. So now we're going to go through and look at some different designs that seem to work really well for some other producers. These are all available on our extension website. That link is at the end of this presentation and in the constant contact as well. So if you want to go through and look at these online, you can also take a virtual tour of these working facilities and get pictures of these diagrams as well. So bud box is the first one that we're going to look at, and this is a pretty unique design, and it allows your handler to be positioned correctly to help facilitate cattle flowing out of the box into that crowd alleyway or a chute or a trailer loadout, depending on what you're doing. This is a flow through part of the facility. We also don't want to make our cows stage in that box or wait there. That way they get kind of stirred up. We want them to move through that as quickly as we can. When you're looking at a bud box, dimensions are really important. We want to make sure that everybody can be in the right position, and a box that's not could really confuse the stock and make it harder for you as well. We want that box to be large enough to accommodate a large volume of cattle to fill that crowd or the alleyway or a trailer compartment. And to crowd that alleyway to a squeeze chute, we might want to hold a minimum of 4 cows, maybe even up to 20, depending on what you're trying to do. We don't want that crowd alley to get empty as we're bringing cattle into that box. So to maintain the flow, lots of times we're letting in a handful of cows while there's still some in the alleyway waiting. So this is more than a one-man operation, and that's important to keep in mind. Most cow-calf operations need a box that's about 12 feet wide to 20 feet deep. Could be as much as 14 feet wide if somebody's going to be on horseback part of the time. If your handler's always on horseback, we recommend closer to 16 feet wide. And if you go through our website, you can get more dimensions on this bud box and how it works. So as we look at this, our cattle come in the catch pens, they funnel through into that bud box, and then they've got a straight shot at the alleyway where they can go into that squeeze chute or loadouts, depending on what they're wanting to do. If you notice in front of the squeeze chute, there's also a swing panel. That means when they let them out of the box, they've got 2 different directions they can go with those calves. If they want to turn them out to the left, they can funnel back around. If, for example, if they need to go out to the loadout once we're done working, there's a place we can hold those cattle there. If they need to go straight back out to the field, there's a gate to the right of the head gate where they could be turned right back out. I also really like that this has a system in front of the head gate. We all like to think that we're great and we're going to catch calves every time, but the reality is sometimes cows slip by. If you've got a way to catch calves outside of that head gate, it's just an extra level of protection that's great all the way around. This next setup, it has a perimeter sweep. So if you look, the sweep is the system that funnels calves around to keep them going forward. So they've got their catch pens, everything can come into this big area, it funnels around depending on what they're trying to move where. And then they've got 4 different holding pens. Depending on where they're moving cattle from, they can close gates between the perimeter fence and the catch pens to funnel cattle in the right direction. And that adjustable alleyway can really be beneficial for them. They have that curved sweep to move them into that alleyway that, again, is narrow enough that cows can't turn around in, that funnels up to their squeeze chute. This next example is really nice because they've even got something covered so that way they can work cattle in the rain if they need to and help move cattle where they need to go regardless of the weather. So they've got their different catch pens. If you look, the 2 edge pens are also rounded. This can make it a little bit easier as we're trying to funnel cattle into those smaller pens. They have their holding pens that have gates that look like they go either direction, again, so we can move cattle out back into the pens when we're done, or we can move them forward to work them and set those gates where they need to be. Once they get in the system, they have that sweep and chute that's under the barn. And if you want to look at that closer, you can go on the website and take the virtual tour as well. This next setup has a center sweep instead of a perimeter sweep. So it's the same kind of thing. You've got your catch pens, you've got gates that function either direction, depending on where we're trying to move cattle to. As they move up through the sweep, they come through the center of the pen, into that alleyway, and into a squeeze chute. Once they get to the squeeze chute, there's different cut gates. So we've got several options to go with those calves when they get done being worked. So we can put them where they need to go. We can keep groups separate if we need to. This next design is a large rectangle. It's built out of portable panels, so it could be moved or changed as they need to. They've got their large catch pen in the back. They move forward through that alleyway. They can be put into smaller pens as they need to. And then over here, when you get to the right side, that's their pen that funnels into the alleyway. You notice they've got a panel added to make that a rounded corner. That way calves don't get hung up. That gate will swing them just like a sweep straight up, and they can either cut to the head gate or they can cut to a loadout. So this is really important as you're looking at these designs to think about the components that you need in your operation to make it successful. This is a modified pen setup. If you look, they can come into this big pen where they're caught. They get funneled into these smaller pens as they need to, and then they get funneled in from the center pen into that alleyway, which also has that same kind of design. They make that corner and go into the squeeze chute. The producer that has this also wanted to note that this worked really well for grouping and sorting, but the owner doesn't like the 90-degree turn in the lane that makes it from that alleyway into the squeeze chute, because that's where cattle tend to stop. So that's one of those things to think about as you're planning this. In this situation, that's one thing that doesn't work very well in this particular setup. This pen has a crowding alleyway. So they come in, depending on where they come in at, there's lots of different catch pens that all funnel to that alley. And as they crowd in there, they can funnel through with that rounded sweep, just like some of the other ones we've seen, and flow in. When it gets up here to the end alley, they can choose whether they run them to the chute or a loadout. Cattle get used to working, and it kind of makes life easier on all of us when they all go the same direction. This is another setup that's built with portable panels. As you can see, it's pretty simple. They've got a large catch pen that can funnel straight up into the alleyway into the squeeze chute. From the squeeze chute, you've got some different options, whether that's the small holding pen to the side or the holding pen that goes straight back out into the pasture. They do have a holding pen in front of the gate, though, just in case something gets out or you want to keep something for a minute. One thing I also really like about this setup is there's room on the left side of the chute with what's probably a gate there at the end. So this is a good place to set up whoever's working the cattle, whether you're giving vaccination, wormers, ear tagging, gives you a little place to be that maybe cattle aren't running as much through beside you. It also has that crowding pen on your way into the sweep as well. That's really important to help us stay successful as we're moving these cows. This is a large facility. It's designed to work around 300 head at a time. So it's important for them that they have these big pens. This one's also built with portable panels. And as you can see, he's got these big catch pens that do kind of have those rounded sides to help move cattle the direction we want them to go. As they funnel in, they've got 3 different sorting pens they can hold them in. For example, if they know they've got to pen a lot of cattle, they can have some in a back pen waiting to move up to a pen waiting to get worked. So by having all these different options to sort on the front end, that helps them work the calves they need to at a time. His funnel system lets him sort in different directions. Those gates move both ways, so he can either let cattle into a pen or let cattle past them. And then it runs into a sweep that'll go straight up and either go to work chute, or they've got a loadout system. This loadout system is also designed where they can back up whatever they need to get loaded. And that's something else to consider as you're choosing a site for this facility, is making sure it's a place that has good access for when you need to move cattle. This design has a lot of curves to it. When we look at how cattle handle in a couple of weeks, we'll talk about the difference between curved lines versus straight lines. And by keeping those curves, it helps keep cattle moving in the right direction. The one producer that had a 90-degree corner said that he really didn't like it. It didn't always work like it was supposed to because cows wanted to stop. Keeping curves helps keep those cattle moving forward. So this system's really unique in the fact that almost all of his pens have a curve to help keep those cattle moving in the right direction until they eventually get up under the roof where they're going to go into their barn to be worked. If you want to see a virtual tour of any of these, remember you can go on our U of A website and see all these. Those are a lot of different designs to work through. Today, I just wanted to take a little bit for us to see some of those components. What are those things that work well? Some designs that have been featured from across the state. If you want to take any of those virtual tours, you can go to our cattle handling facilities on the U of A website, There's also the MP, that's cattle working facilities, that we'll look at for the next couple weeks. And as always, if you've got questions about any of this, or you want to do a walkthrough of your facility and see maybe some things that could be changed, or talk about what's working or not working, don't hesitate to give us a call. Thank you for joining us for this week's session of Fridays on the Farm. Next week, we're going to continue this discussion and start talking about some of our head gates and squeeze chutes. We'll see you next Friday.